My guest today is an author. He's recently published a novel, his first novel. And this is it. It's called Cold Edge of Heaven, a story of love and murder in Canada's Arctic. And he's writing about a subject he knows very, very well, having traveled extensively in Canada's north. We first met in the 1980s when we were both colleagues at the CBC. Since then, he's gone on to chair the Canadian Polar Commission. He was also the executive director of the National Inuit Organization, Inuit Tapiriit Kanatami. And today, he happens to be the vice-regal consort of Canada's Governor-General, Mary Simon. It's my pleasure to welcome His Excellency, Whit Fraser, to the program. Hi, Whit.
Karl, thank you very much.
Great to see you again.
Thank you.
And you're looking fabulous. Tell me about the title of your novel, Cold Edge of Heaven. How did you come up with it?
The title poured out from the end of my hands as I was writing. Initially, the working title was Human Flagpoles, because the story essentially is Canada's sovereignty efforts in the 1920s in the Arctic, where they put Mounties on uninhabited islands as human flagpoles to assert sovereignty. But as I wrote, the words came out and I said, I'll hang on to those.
It's a good title.
Yeah.
Now, this book takes place, roughly 100 years ago. And I was thinking as I was reading it, the North back then must have been such a different place from what it is today, what with the influence of the South and also, not to mention climate change. I was just wondering, have you seen many changes in the North in your lifetime?
I saw both sides. I saw the changes in the people. When this book is set, This was a far different Canada, because the Inuit, or Eskimos as they were called then, they weren't citizens, and the government never considered them citizens. In my lifetime, I've seen an Inuk named John Amigualik be given credit as a father of Confederation because he redrew the map of Canada and created the territory of Nunavut. That's citizenship. So that's how far we've come on that. And the climate change, the last few years I've had some great opportunities to be through the Northwest Passage, and in a sense that's where the inspiration for the book came from, on one of those trips. But to see the icebergs now, I mean, I was on north of Baffin Island a couple of years ago, and from the deck of the ship, I counted 40 huge icebergs, that had peeled off the glacier in Greenland.
Wow. And
the days are warmer. There's a month earlier sometimes is the breakup in springtime. Winters are later. There's rain sometimes in places like Iqaluit or Pangnirtung. In the middle of the winter, you might get a rainstorm where you would never have even dreamed of that before. So on both sides, it's just been a remarkable change.
Yeah. You mentioned a trip to the north as inspiration for this novel, but it was a specific trip and a specific scene that kind of gave you the idea, wasn't it?
It was. Yeah. Maybe I'm a slow learner, Karl, but it was the fifth trip that I made to a place called Dundas Harbour, which is on Devon Island, almost in the center of the Northwest Passage. First time I went there was in the early 70s. And then 40 years unfolded of traveling a lot of ice and snow and meeting a lot of different people, and some of them became very good friends. One I married. And so I had this lifetime of first-hand experience with the northern people. And the last time I went to Dundas Harbour, I was with a cruise company called Adventure Canada, and I was doing presentations through the day or through the evening, and my day job was a polar bear guard. And so I sat for 6 or 7 hours overlooking the graves of 2 Mounties out of 3 who were put on Devon Island in 1924. They both died violently from gunshot wounds, and then there was a 3rd grave of an Inuit child who died in the 1930s when the Hudson Bay Company had a temporary post there. And I looked at the graves, and images went through my head. And when I came back to the ship, I said, I've got a book. Yeah.
Just like that.
Just like that. Well, I did the 45 or 50 years of research, but I knew it was a book, yeah.
Now, the book begins with 3 Mounties traveling to the north to establish something called a sovereignty post. What was a sovereignty post, and what would their job have been?
Their job was to have a presence. That was simply their job. There was no crime because no one was living there. They were to record if they saw ships in the summertime. They would be to record movements of any ships they would see. They would also make patrols by dog team. They would do some mapping, or rough mapping. They would build cairns. They would plant flags or leave cairns in the name of Canada, and they were to leave signs that Canada was owning and occupying the high Arctic, because at the time, and it was driven actually by a great northern explorer named Joseph Bernier, and Bernier had been writing to the government saying, because he sailed the north every summer, he knew the number of American and Norwegian and other ships that were coming in and out of the Northwest Passage, some of them exploring, some fishing, some looking for taking fur. And so he said to the government, quite convincingly, but over a long period of time, if we don't claim the Arctic, we're going to lose it just as quickly as we lost Alaska to the Americans. And so we have to claim it. And one prime minister agreed and said, we need to do something. So the plan came up, send Mounties, and that happened, and that they maintained that up for another 20 years or more.
So it was not until the 1920s when Canada really got serious about asserting sovereignty in the north.
That's right, not until the 1920s. Which seems straight, but in the high north,
yes.
in the lower north, of course, the fur industry in the Hudson Bay was well established, and there was a better sense of claim and ownership there.
And I guess Labrador, for example, would be the lower
is
north.
A great example, and and in the Mackenzie Valley and through the Northwest Territories with the fur industry, but above the 60th and 64th parallel and above the Arctic Circle, there was very little activity at that time.
Now, these Mounties traveled to the north aboard a ship, which you mentioned the name Bernier, was captained by a man named Bernier. It certainly wasn't a luxury trip, and it got quite harrowing as they went through the Strait of Belle Isle, I believe. Can you describe what these northern going vessels would have been like back then?
They were roughly 100 meters. There was very few of them. Bernier's ship went every year for many years. It was a sailing ship and diesel or gasoline engines. And so they had both engine power or steam power, steam and sail. And he had recorded quite a few serious gales, and one of them I wove into the historical fiction account. But it was probably quite close to what must have happened that night, because the deck cargo let loose was filling up the scuppers, and the winds were 40 or 50 feet, and they could have perished. And good seamanship and Mounties did come up on the deck and tried to throw coal bags, lumber, and whatever else was washing on the deck overboard, get the rest of it lashed down in the vicious storm. And then, after that, there was more than a foot of water in the engine room, and they had no power at all, and they had to hand pump the ship and then repair the boilers, a lot of broken pipes, and repair all the boilers, and tried to move along under sail at the same time. But that was sort of typical for it, and it gave me a great little twist in the book, because once my hero, Will, finds himself all alone, he's sitting on Devon Island at Dundas Harbor, and he says to himself, "Does anybody know where I am? What if Bernier
didn't make it back? Yeah.
You know, and what if people thought that Bernier perished on the way up, you know, and saw debris in the water from the storm?" So that adds to the mystery anyway.
Yeah. When I was reading about Bernier, I kept thinking, for some reason, well, for an obvious reason, I guess, about Captain Bob Bartlett.
Yeah.
Because Bartlett was that kind of captain, I guess. There's a line, Whit, in the book which really resonated for me. Wonderful line, and it's where the hero, Will Grant, is talking to the Inuk, Pudlu, and Pudlu says to him, "In our old stories, we talk of the time when we thought we were the only people in the world." And I thought, yeah, that speaks so much to the ancient bond which our indigenous people have to this country and to the isolation of the North. Is that what you intended, or?
Oh, yes. Pudlu's 5 or 6 friends of mine, all in one. And somebody did say that to me one time, an elderly man. When somebody says that to you, Karl, and you think about it, it changes you, you know. And it was because of some things like that I really knew that I had to write the book. It was a gift, you know. I sat there, I saw it, I thought, all those memories come back. The whole shooting match was a gift for the last 50 years, and I said, I have to do something with it, you know. This needs to be put down, and also the moments after Will arrives on Devon Island, Pudlu says, "Come up here, I want to show you something." And he shows him where there are tent rings from thousands of years ago, and people were camping there thousands of years ago. Yeah. And Will says, Columbus didn't discover America. I mean, people were here, so it really cemented that view that we thought we were the only people in the world. You know? Yeah.
Now, these Mounties, they were all war vets, because of course this is set right after the First World War. And one of them is obviously suffering from mental illness, possibly shell shock, as it would have been called back then, I guess. Were the Mounties, to a large extent, the ranks of the Mounties, were they made up of vets?
Well, the thing is that from what I've read and what I've heard from my father and grandfather, everybody was a vet. And there were so many damaged people at the end of World War I. And there were hospitals full of veterans with shell shock. And I remember stories from our own family, you know, of a shell-shocked great uncle and others. So that was really a hard time, plus the flu epidemic, plus tuberculosis, you know, and two of the soldiers believed that the war was finally behind them, and the third one, pitifully, the war, he never left the war, you know, when he came to Canada. And he masked it. There's different ways in the book where initially he had masked it before he got sent north, and he was the strong and the strong one and the leader, but yet mentally he...
And it was exacerbated by heavy drinking as well.
Yeah. Or the heavy drinking was a way of trying to handle the fear, you know. Yeah.
Did you do any research into PTSD for the book at all?
No. I went with stories that I'd read, conversations I had and things that I'd seen as a child, a young man or teenager. So I went with that, and I wanted to stay true to that time, and that's why I'm careful not to use PTSD.
Of course.
But even one of the three Mounties, he identifies with Villeneuve, who's suffering shell shock because of his own dear brother, as you know, in a hospital in Saskatchewan. So, yeah.
So the other thing I picked up from the book is that the North, the landscape, the climate, the environment really is a character in a way in this novel, isn't it?
It is. It's both the villain and the hero sometimes. And those places like up the mountain valleys, the ice flows and being on the sea ice, the icebergs. I mean, I was very fortunate to be able to do and see that and remember it. But the other point that I wanted to make is, in the book, it's fiction, so you can create your own adventure. So I can create an avalanche and create a polar bear attack and create ice breaking up underneath people and all of the dangers and whiteouts and storms. But in the summer months, the one thing that they do not face in the book, nobody goes hungry. Hunger is never an issue for them because that land is so bountiful if you know where to go and how to go, and the Inuit made sure that they knew that much, you know. Yeah.
Speaking of that, I never thought I'd say this in an interview, Whit, but I don't think I'll ever read a better description of a muskox being skinned and butchered. And not only that, but when they cooked it, I was getting hungry. I wanted to know what that beast tasted like. That description is so detailed, so visual. Had you seen?
Oh yes.
Yeah.
Oh yes.
It certainly seemed accurate. Yeah.
Oh yes.
Yeah.
And you need a sharp knife.
Yeah. Have you tasted? And you've tasted?
Oh, lots of. Yeah, I've had muskox many times, and it's not gamey. It's not tough or stringy like moose. It's different. It's different than venison. Mm-hmm. It has its own distinct texture and flavor, and it's wonderful. And if it's properly cooked and cooked slowly, it can be very tender. And other times it can be butchered wrong or cooked wrong, and it can be like leather, same as beef. You know, you never. Yeah.
So you mentioned the avalanche. the other event which happens in the book is a glacier breaking apart. That you wrote about that so beautifully. I mean, I felt like I was there seeing it, you know. It's so visual. Had you actually seen a glacier break apart, or?
I had seen that glacier at Croker Bay several times, and I had watched it peel away in the summer. And I heard the crashes from the ice, the glacier itself breaking away, and the noises that makes. And then I had been on big lakes and on the ocean when the ice has dropped, and the thunderous, thunder is coming from the seabed rather than the sky. So I did see that, but I was never in front of the Croker Bay glacier in midwinter, but I am in the book. But the combination of the two of them clearly works.
Clearly, yeah. Did you? I know you based Pudlu on various people, but did you do that with all your characters? Did you base them on people you've known?
Yes, but I'm not sure I knew I'm not sure I've known the. Yes, I did. Yes, I did. Absolutely. Zalapsky is a very quiet and organized and thoughtful and caring person, and the kind of person where you'd really want the kind of person you'd want to have with you if you were going to be in a situation like that. And I tried to, as I'm sure the Mountie did in real life, in superintendent or inspector did 100 years ago, he chose them for different reasons. He chose one for his strength and his leadership ability and his record and as a hero. That was who turned out to be, if villain is the right word, Zalapsky for his organizational ability, and somebody needed to have some sense of the land and the water and all of that, and that's Grant, the Nova Scotian, who was familiar around ships, and his brother. I will say this. His brother that he thinks about constantly in Nova Scotia, who was also a carver and a musician and all of that. Well, that's my grandfather, and I don't apologize for that. So that's old Pop Grant, and I was a little boy when he died, but I always remembered him. So
I also liked the fact that you were able to work some history into this. You mentioned the Franklin expedition, and you even put in A.Y. Jackson, one of our most famous artists in this country, and the discoverer of insulin, Dr. Banting. Talk about Banting and Jackson. Were they, in fact, that interested in Canada asserting sovereignty in the North?
There's two words describe that. Blind luck. Blind luck. So I have to get, whether he's alive or not, I have to get Will out in 1927, and that's where I am when I'm writing. Now it's time to get him out. So I begin doing some more research. One ship came out that year that the Mounties used for the Eastern Arctic Patrol called the Beothic. And its port was not Montreal or Quebec City like the Arctic, and a different captain, but North Sydney. And I found the manifest for the ship, and Banting and A.Y. Jackson were on it. And I was careful. I needed to be very careful, and I was told this by editors and publishers. You need to be careful when you're using historical figures. You can't put words in their mouth that they may not have spoken, or give them views that they may not have had. and I was conscious of that. So the conversation is quite innocuous because Will had taught himself, luckily, to paint in the chapter before, so he can ask Jackson for lessons. The government sent them both there as also part of sovereignty. The government wanted Jackson's pictures to show in art galleries and museums, Canada's Arctic. This is the country we own, and our painters are painting it. So they were very interested, and later one of the other group of 7, Lauren Harris, made many trips. Banting went along because he was friends with Jackson. He was also quite a good painter, but he was not a part of the group. And and Banting at the time took the government to task for the way that it had treated the Eskimos, in his words. And I did in the research and found that on September 7th, 1927, front page of Toronto Star, Banting blasts government for treatment of Eskimos. And I didn't have to put any words in his mouth. And he and Will were of the same view about the way people have been treated.
Whit, unfortunately, we're all out of time, but we could keep on going for the next half hour. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Congratulations on this book, which is published by Boulder, by the way, called The Cold Edge of Heaven.
A great publishing company.
And a great read. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We'll see you again next time.